This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. October 7th, 2003. Gregory Peterson, president of the Jackson Center, and Professor John Barrett conduct an interview with Jackson law clerk and Jamestown native George Niebank. This interview gives an intimate portrait of Justice Jackson.
I'd like to hear about both Harry and Emerson Parker.
Well,
Harry was obviously a fixture at the
Harry was a fixture. He had been the clerk for James Clark McReynolds for many years. And as a matter of fact, apparently someone did a biography of Reynolds last year or the year before. And Bill Rehnquist, Mr. Justice Rehnquist, told me when I saw him in his office June. He said, there's this new biography, and the only picture they had of Harry was with you and me, so you and I are in that too. But if I could find the author or whatever and tell him, look, I've got one all by himself. If you have a second edition, you can certainly run this one if you want to.
It's a wonderful book. You'll love it. It's actually a law clerk's memoir of clerking for McReynolds during the October term 1936. So it's the court packing, turn corner year, NLRB, Jones and Laughlin and all that. And Harry is the hero of the book.
Is he?
He is absolutely the hero of the book.
Harry, for such things as McReynolds was very independent, and at one point there was a conference of the court, but McReynolds had decided to go duck shooting over in Alexandria somewhere, and in effect said, well, the hell with the conference, I'm going duck hunting. And so they got into the conference, and the Chief Justice, I don't know who it would have been, Stone maybe?
Hughes or Stone.
Or Hughes or Stone. You heard this story?
Well, there's some duck hunting stories, but I'm not sure I know this one.
And he called Harry and said, where's Mac? He said, well, sir, he's over he's over duck hunting. I said, well, go get him and tell him to come back. So Harry goes out and gets in a taxi and goes all the way over to Alexandria because he knew about where he was, and he trudged out to McReynolds' duck blind and said, the chief sent me out to bring you back. And he said words to that effect, nuts. So he didn't, those I'm sure were not his words, I don't know what they were. Harry said, well, I come all the way over here with a cab. Who's going to pay for the cab? And McReynolds said, well, the chief sent you to collect from the chief.
Is this a story Harry was telling you?
No. Somebody else had told us that. But Harry's mother was a famed cook on the East Coast. And her specialty dish was a turtle soup of some sort. And Harry learned how to cook under the aegis of his mother. But, of course, I don't know how old Harry was when I encountered him. He'd been with McReynolds for 26 years, and then with Jackson 10.
He was born around 1877.
He was well along in years. Anyhow, Harry, as he got on in years, was the dean of the messengers, and of which there were, of course, 9. And the qualifications for being a messenger sort of varied from office to office, as did their job description. And Harry's principally was to cook, because she didn't want him driving. He was too old. I'm not even sure he knew how to drive. But he was a really good cook. Jackson, the court, most of the members of the court would have lunch together up in the dining room upstairs, but RHJ didn't do that. And he told me why. He said, I think law all morning, all afternoon, all night. He said, I'm on a break at noon. So he didn't do that. Instead, Harry made him lunch, which he would bring down in one of those things with a sterno can, heating the whole thing. And I guess they were all pretty good.
A court kitchen somewhere else?
Upstairs.
In the building? Okay.
Well, from the kitchen where they served the dining room for the justices.
Okay.
Harry'd bring it down in a cart. One time he came in and he like some of the others, he'd come through my door, and then you had to go through the door into Elsie's office, then another door into RHJ's office. Well, he came through, and I said, Harry, that smells good. He said, good hell, that's damn excellent.
Now, did you refer to him as Harry or Mr. Parker?
Harry.
Harry, okay.
And he said he was writing a book. So whenever you do something like that, he'd say, you're in the book. You're in the book. But as I started to say, he was the dean of those messengers. And he had saw to it personally that each one of them had a savings account of some kind in the bank. Actually, he ran that so assiduously that he personally would collect the money from them and take it to the bank, and he kept their bank books to be sure they all had something to fall back on. I can't think of too much more to tell you about Harry.
Do you know anything about his family background?
No, except
Of his mother?
Except I
Was
told
she
you.
a cook in a private home or a restaurant?
My impression was that it was in the better homes, possibly even in embassies. I just don't know, John.
Okay.
But she was apparently a very well-known cook, especially on the basis of the reputation of her turtle soup.
And Mrs. Parker, did you ever know anything about Harry's spouse?
Never.
Okay. He had Emerson, I think he had more than one son.
I think so, but I didn't know the others. But Emerson started to show up with his father in about the time I was there, and I can't tell you exactly when it was when we were there, but he just did what Harry might do, except that he didn't cook. Harry only cooked. Oh, I started to tell you about how the job descriptions of the messengers varied from office to office. Felix Frankfurter's messenger was a fellow everybody called Chicken. Tom something or other. And they called him that because he was a champion chicken plucker. But what he did was he chauffeured Felix. And but he was a nice man. But the others I didn't get to know very well. But you might be interested in this story. Not only Supreme Court justices, but other senior government officers routinely had what they called messengers. And as I said, those job descriptions varied from office to office depending on the whim of the person of the person involved. And at one point, one of the Supreme Court messengers passed away, and I forget who he worked for. I'm going to use two court names, but I'm not sure that they're accurate. I think it may have been Stone's messenger passed away. They're going to have the service Thursday at noon or whatever, and he thought he'd better go, but he didn't want to go alone. So he talked to one of the other justices and talked him into going to the funeral with him. So they went in and they sat down in the back of the church, hoping that nobody would see them. And at one point, someone said, "And will the members of the Supreme Court please stand?" And they thought, oh, dear God. And then they look up, and there's 8 African Americans stand up towards the front row. Well, come to find out that every senior officer in Washington was a messenger. The messenger in the black community took on the title of the man from whom he worked. So you'd have the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of State.
The Speaker of the House, the Chief
Yes.
Justice of the United States.
Right.
That's amazing. Now, Jackson wasn't the second justice who was with Stone in the church?
No.
Okay.
No. How did I hear that story?
Whose story was that?
I can't say.
Okay.
It might even have been Jackson's, but I don't think so. I don't know. You hear so many stories.
Would Harry interact with you guys much? Would he tell you stories or stop and chat in your
We'd
office?
stop and chat,
Uh-huh.
because that's where we'd get into with the comments with the
book.
you're in the book,
Right.
but not a great deal.
I mean, like McReynolds stories? Would he ever reminisce about?
No, he was not one to tell those kind of things. Now, one time, this is after I left, the present Chief Justice told me this, and he had succeeded me. And Harry took sick, and it's okay if I call it Bill, isn't it?
It's totally. He's
Bill-
your friend. You've known him as
Bill,
Bill since you were young men.
Bill called Harry on the phone and said he wanted to come up to see him. Harry said, "No, you don't come out to this neighborhood. Don't come." So he thought, well, I'm going anyway. So he went out and he went up on the porch and was coming to the front door, which had the glass in the windows next to it, or maybe in the door. And Harry opened the door and said to him, "White men don't come in this neighborhood," and closed the door. Wouldn't let him in. So that was the environment from which Harry came.
The Chief Justice actually told us, at least an anecdote I remember about Harry Parker. He said that Harry could never pronounce Rehnquist. So he referred to you guys as Mr. Niebank and Mr. O, whatever your name is.
I guess that's probably right.
He had Niebank and he'd stick on Rehnquist. And he became increasingly frail, I guess, during your time as a law clerk, Harry?
Well, Harry was still active when I left. I wouldn't call him frail at all. He was there when he was supposed to be.
Okay.
But he, as I said before, he was getting on in years.
Right.
And it wasn't, as far as I know, until Bill succeeded me that Harry took sick. And I can't tell you what the sickness was either. May have been the flu or what, who knows.
Right. Yeah, no, I think he passed away not too long after your clerkship ended. And one of the things I've read somewhere is the juxtaposition that when McReynolds died, no one came to his funeral from the court. And when Harry Parker died, either all of the justices or almost all of the justices went to Harry Parker's funeral.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine.
Which is...
But then they wouldn't have to ask, they could ask who the supreme members of the Supreme Court to stand and get the right ones.
Right.
During your tenure on the court, the case that seems to be most prevalent is the discussion of the steel seizure case.
Right.
In fact, in your friend, Chief Justice Rehnquist's book, he talks about how once they granted certiorari, Justice Jackson suggested a somewhat offhand way that both George and I should familiarize ourselves with the briefs in the case when they came in, but he certainly gave no indication at that point, to me at any rate, of any leanings he might have had. What was the buzz? It happened so quickly. And
Well, my take on all that, because I've been recently, I commented in a note to the Chief Justice how the nature of the cases that come before the court has changed from our time, and we don't have the issues we have now. And then he reminded me, "Oh, don't forget the steel seizure case," and I hadn't forgotten it. I took away from the court a complete set of the briefs in that case. I have no idea where they are now. At some point in some house cleaning out they went. But my memory of the case is not as distinct as Bill's. I remember obviously you couldn't help but be impressed by it. And the importance of it, but the thing that stuck in my mind at the time, almost more than anything else, was how quickly it moved. You know, it was in and it was gone. The result surprised nobody. And it didn't surprise me. And an interesting aside in that, after they announced the decision, at that time, Tom Clark sat on one side of Jackson, probably on the left. And Tom Clark announced his concurrence, and I don't remember whether he wrote an opinion or not. But Jackson leaned over to him and whispered, "I'm glad to see that you've decided to be a judge, Tom." Now, Jackson told me that, and I'm sure he did.
And that was on decision day. That's it.
Yes, when they announced the decision from the bench.
Right. That's not what Harry Truman thought Tom Clark had become.
No. But at that point, it became clear that Tom Clark had become a judge.
Right. Wonderful line.
Chief Justice Rehnquist rewrites in his book that after the conference, George Niebank and I were both present and eager to learn the outcome when the justices went into conference. He describes the custom. And then the conference ends at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and George and I hung around the door waiting for Justice Jackson to make his appearance. He told us to come into his chambers as he usually did after conference, and we had no sooner sat down with our tongues all but hanging out when he looked at us and said, "Remember that?"
Yeah. The president got beat or something.
Well, boys, the president got licked. That wasn't a surprise to you as far as the results?
No. Of course, by that time the thing was all settled, but it didn't surprise me. I don't think it surprised anybody.
Did Jackson elaborate at all? I mean, aside from
No.
this, you guys were really...
But you know, the thing is, it's the kind of issue that you can research until you're blue in the face, and you're not going to find a whole lot. And so it wasn't one of those where you get a really exhaustive supply of research materials and things upon which to rely in writing an opinion.
Rehnquist states that it is one of those celebrated constitutional cases where what might be called the tide of public opinion suddenly began to run against the government for a number of reasons, and that this tide of public opinion had a considerable influence on the court. Do you agree?
I certainly was not aware of it.
Yeah.
You know, it isn't that the Supreme Court doesn't follow the election returns,
Right.
but I just can't answer that.
Right.
If there was, in the 50 years after the fact, I don't remember it.
In that context, or more generally, would Justice Jackson give voice to any of his opinions about Harry Truman?
Well, no. He was not one to generally to speak of other people. He did on occasion, but I was telling, guess you weren't here when I told the story about at a dinner at Justice Black's. Did you hear me tell that story?
I think I've heard you tell it on videotape.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Where the justices and President Truman were at the dinner at Justice Black's house, which was a routine for him following a court session. And apparently they got to discussing the steel seizure case, and Truman said, "Well, you know, I almost came up and argued that case myself." And Douglas leaned over and clapped him on the knee and said, "Why didn't you?"
You probably would have done a better job than Perlman did.
Perlman was at, well, I think he probably would have.
Right.
Perlman, I'll never forget him. I thank you for bringing that name up because I was going to look it up because I remember that man very, very well. He used to make a theatrical production out of motions for admissions to the court. And that sort of in my mind leads to this. And I think others pretty much shared the same experience. When you first go to the court, it's an enthralling, and you go and you have those special spots you can sit and listen to oral argument. And after a couple of months of listening to oral arguments, I decided that I had better things to do, mostly than do that, because the arguments were tedious, boring, and the most important things in the cases were the briefs. And it concluded, and it's not original with me, that you don't win cases on oral argument, but you sure as heck can lose them. Some of the outstanding people I heard argue was, for example, John W. Davis.
In steel seizure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was good.
Right.
And it was when I was thinking of him when I had occasion to argue some things myself, to remember how it was that he argued. And it wasn't bombastic. He just sort of draped himself around the lectern and talked. And he was good, very good. There are mostly lawyers that really don't know what they're doing there, who make these bombastic jury-like arguments, which of course don't cut the ice at all. It doesn't help. As for the most part, those cases are decided before the oral argument anyway. I didn't say that. Well, they make up their mind principally on the basis of the briefs, and what the briefs serve sometime is to provide fodder for questions for the argument. And so except when people like John W. Davis came to argue, I didn't bother with oral arguments much thereafter.
During your 2 years, do you remember Thurgood Marshall arguing? I'm not sure there was a big...
He was not there.
Yeah, I don't know.
He
just before you were there and just after you were gone, he had big cases.
He may have argued it. No, I don't think he did while I was there.
Okay.
So I can't comment on his style
Okay.
or effectiveness.
Would Jackson critique the advocates? Would you ever get a little post-game evaluation? Because he'd been SG and himself such a great advocate.
No.
No, okay.
No, he didn't. It just wasn't his style generally
Right.
to comment on other people's work.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the great number of cases that come before the court are not as well represented as they could be. Now I'm really getting on thin ice now, and I know that. But so often the lawyers really don't know what's going on at the court and tend to argue the merits instead of other points. Now, I always used to tell anybody who asked, and there weren't too many, you got a case going to the Supreme Court, get the latest issue of Stern and Gressman, and do what Stern and Gressman tells you. And that would make a really short petition, which is just exactly right. I say, but I don't have it anymore, the best petition for certiorari I ever saw, and I reviewed a couple of thousand of them, was from some lawyer off in some small town, I don't know, in Oklahoma or Nebraska. It was terrific. He just went right down the line doing what he was supposed to do. I don't remember whether he got a grant or not. But the petition was precisely what the court, what the rules and the procedures called for. I almost wrote him a note to tell him that, but I thought, no, I better hadn't.
Right.
You are listening to Justice, History, and the Law, lectures and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Today, an interview with George Niebank.
You had a chance to argue one or two cases.
One case.
One case?
Right.
What was that like?
What was it about?
Well, it was, what,
Morissetti? No. Oh, the Santa Fe Trail Transportation Company. Yeah, now I'm having another senior moment.
Was it McDonald versus Santa
Yeah,
Fe?
McDonald be the Santa Fe Trail Transportation Company. And depends on who you talk to about that case. Whether you talk to, most of my friends called me afterwards to congratulate me on losing the case. And it was a discrimination case. And I tried to get into it. The concepts that they're following now about a little affirmative action voluntarily is a good thing, or can be a good thing. You know, not rampant or anything like that. I think in these two cases, I'm a little hazy. I didn't know you were going to ask about that. I should have reviewed the thing. The petitioners were two white employees of our motor carrier subsidiary, and they were complaining about they and two African Americans had been involved in substantially the same conduct, and they got canned and the African Americans didn't. And at the time I was arguing that, well, you know, a little bit of affirmative action is okay. But the court never really got to that. And one of the things I argued, it didn't occur to me until the night before, that the case had no business being before the court at all. You know, there have been instances where the court has dismissed a writ of certiorari as improvidently granted. And so I thought, why don't you hit him with that? Well, I did, but it wasn't very successful. And Rehnquist said from the bench, he said, "Mr. Niebank, do you think we should go back to chitty on pleading?" And but I enjoyed arguing the case, and it doesn't involve any landmark principle and didn't make any landmark law. I didn't make the principal argument that I wanted to because the court had just 2 years before rejected it.
Right.
And I thought, you know, there's not a whole bunch of sense in making an argument they have explicitly rejected 2 years ago, so I didn't. But there were two dissenting votes, one the Chief Justice, and I forget who the other one was, and they dissented on the ground that they ought to reconsider the case from 2 years before. I want to reconsider it, which I really felt I'd look foolish if I urged them to do that, so I didn't do it.
Personalities of the court. Did Justice Jackson talk about Justice Black?
No, for the most part he didn't. No, I think Bill will give you a little bit different slant on that, but of course that was something that I was very sensitive to and I kind of looked to. And Justice Black was very cordial to us. I mean, that is RHJ's clerks. And the only thing I ever heard Jackson say about him was complimentary.
Would he come in, would they be in each other's chambers?
No,
No.
that did not happen.
Okay. Other than Felix?
Nobody else did.
Nobody else, okay.
It just didn't happen.
Right, okay.
But as I said before, I think one of the things that the closeness of those two, what it indicates, was the quality of Jackson's scholarship. Because Felix could be intolerant, but he and Justice Jackson was the country lawyer and he was the Harvard professor, and they got along just great. Felix was in my office a lot.
Right.
He'd come through there like Harry with the food. He'd come through on the way to see the boss, and he'd always stop and chat for a while, and he'd stand and he'd rattle the doorknob and bring something else would come up talking about a case, and he couldn't remember a case by its title, by the caption. The only thing he could remember was who argued it.
Right.
And he would go over to the shelves and pick down the cases and look to see who argued the case. And that's how he found it.
Now, were these drop-bys, or would he have called Jackson to say, I'm coming over, or did he have an appointment?
Can't answer. Certainly did not have an appointment, I wouldn't think. He may have called and asked, can I drop by? My feeling at the time that they were just drop-bys.
And then how long would he spend with Jackson? Once he was done with you and done with Elsie and into RHJ's?
It's hard for me to answer that because he didn't go out the same route he came in.
Right.
But, so I just can't answer that.
Was Jackson's style with you guys a kind of drop by, walk in, or you would only come in when he called you?
Well, we didn't do too much drop in, but we could, but we usually ask Elsie if it was okay. This may be hard to understand, or hard to comprehend, but there really wasn't that much interaction between us and the justice in regard to pending cases and cases that were being written up. He did his thing and we did ours.
Right.
And if he had a question, he'd ask it, as I show in some of these papers. And I don't recall ever discussing with him the relative merits of a position in a case, one side or the other, whether it be a petition for certiorari, which I know we never did, or on the merits of a case. See, he would produce draft of opinion when we didn't get it in the yellow page stage. That's from that point that Elsie typed it. So the first thing we'd see would be the draft typed by Elsie, and where our work came in was he would indicate where he wanted footnotes, and we would fill in the footnotes. Or if there's one of the notes I have here, we might comment. Usually it would be in writing on one part or another of the opinion. And he would respond as he did in that one. And you'll see that. And other than that, we didn't go in and talk with him at any great length. Not because he was opposed to talking, because that's just not true.
Right.
But the reason they went on was it's the way it was. And I think, for the most part, that's the way it was in the other offices, but I don't know. I know in some offices, the clerks essentially wrote all the opinions. But as I said before, I think that's more common than not, or they may not write all of them, but a large part of them. But that sure as heck was not true in our office.
Right. Did he ever talk to you about the move from 2 clerks in your first year down to 1 clerk for the first part of your second year? Obviously it's a compliment to you. He thought well of you and your work and asked you to stay on. But he didn't replace Cushman effectively.
No. I don't recall discussing that. Well, obviously we had to. But, I believe I talked with you over the phone about Rehnquist coming in.
Right.
For a long time.
We figured that one out now.
We figured that one out. Rehnquist used to kid. He'd say George thought he was doing fine. Then in the middle of this thing, Iraq came. And the truth is, I was doing well. But I'd been called back in the Navy. Well, you know this story. So all of a sudden, around the middle of the term, Justice Jackson didn't know how much longer I was going to be there. And so at that point, obviously, it behooves him to, because Bill was more or less lined up to come in after I left anyway. to see if he could come earlier, which he did arrange through Phil Neal. And of course, it worked out great. Nothing could have been better for me, because we got along so well. And we were essentially the only conservatives in the whole courtroom building. Although by that time, in many schools of thought, I think RHJ had, at least among that crowd, come to be considered pretty conservative. He had a way of saying that judicial experience has a way of making conservatives out of liberals and liberals out of conservatives. And I think that's true.
The case that was most memorable during your time, aside steel seizure, was what? The Dennis case?
No. Yeah, this will surprise you. It was probably Morissette v. United States. In that case, which involved, now again here, I have not reviewed it, so my memory is just a tad hazy. In that case, the court had pretty much just determined to deny certiorari. And this man, Morissette, had been convicted of stealing government property. He lived up in Michigan, and he was accused of, there was a firing range not far from where he lived, and with an easy eye of the road that went by this fence, the Army had left a huge pile of expended brass shells, those great big suckers. And so he went in and thought, well, geez, I'm not going to let those go to waste. And so he filled up his pickup truck with them and took them back to his house. And being a very secretive type fellow, dumped them in his front yard. So all of a sudden he winds up convicted of converting government property. And it was about to be affirmed when I got to Justice Jackson and said, this is not right. And the question of intent is really open here. He agreed, and in short order, we got certiorari was granted. And that was the kind of case that he just loved. He got, of all the cases I saw him work on, he had more volumes sent down from the library in connection with Morissette than any of the others. And of course, he wrote, which I trust has become one of the backbones of the law of intent in statutory construction. And he liked it. He loved to do research. I often wondered what would happen now if you had to use a computer. He would not have liked that. Of course, I wouldn't like it either. Happily, I got out of the work pretty much before that became the norm. But I don't think he would have adjusted to the computer age at all well. Another case that stands out in my mind was I'm forgetting the name, another senior moment. But it involved, of all things, based on a divorce. You think, well, how does a divorce proceeding get in here? Well, it had to do with full faith and credit. And the name of that case.
I think it's in your book, probably, because that's probably where his comment about
the North Carolina case about a person not being able to tell where they're married and where they're divorced.
Yeah.
Here it is. Eston?
No. I've got it back in the room, but I didn't think that was coming up.
You keep talking, I'll see if I can find it.
In any case, it was one of those situations where one of them got a divorce in one jurisdiction and then had remarried, and the other one had not remarried or something like that. So that there were 7 people, wound up with 7 people involved. So that in the draft of a memo, Justice Jackson to get the court to grant certiorari on this very interesting conflicts question. He's opened by saying this case involves not the usual triangle, but a pentagon of individuals. Well, nobody knew who was married to whom, no matter where they went. And they resolved it. And don't press me about the result. But, you know, that was one of the things that impressed upon me, one of the things that I considered a good deal was the variety of cases that came to the Supreme Court, the subject matter. A lot of it, frankly, is kind of dry and cut and dry, but boy, there's a lot of the others. The very first case that I really had anything to do with was A&P v. Supermarket Equipment Company, a patent case where in those days when the checkout counter at the supermarket, somebody had invented like a big rectangular pool type thing with a handle on it, so you just put your groceries in there and pull it up. The question was whether it's patentable or not. And I didn't know whether it was patentable or not. I didn't know anything about that. But I found out, along the way, I found out that patent and trademark lawyers are prolific writers. Nobody understands them except one another, but they're prolific writers. An interesting part of that case was that the justice had gone to New York for the weekend. And I was home on a Saturday evening, and the phone rang. It's Justice Frankfurter. He said, "George?" I said, "Yes." And he just told me who he was. I said, "Evening, Mr. Justice." He said, "Did you know that every question of patentability involves a question of constitutional law?" Hell, I didn't know even what a question of patentability was. So I said, "Well, no, Mr. Justice, I'm afraid I didn't know that." He said, "Well, have you seen Douglas's opinion that he circulated today?" I said, "No, I haven't seen that either." He said, "Where's the boss?" I told him he's in New York. And then the conversation kind of trailed off, and I was waiting till RHJ to get back to get at him about the situation in A&P v. Supermarket Equipment. Now I'm being bugged by not being able to remember the caption of that case.
Well, that's why I have John here. We'll track that down.
Worst case, I'm not finding it either.
Oh, yeah.
So
Go ahead.
what had been wrong with Justice Douglas's opinion?
Well, that questions of constitution, questions of patentability don't involve constitutional issues. You know, it's whether there's I think the test they came up with is stroke of genius or some bloody thing like that. I mean, you'd be surprised at some of the crazy things that come up there and the question of patentability. One man brought up you wonder that the dispute could come out of this. He had so-called invented a bowl for feeding children, which had like the one side of the bowl went up. And there was a little teddy bear sitting there with his mouth open, so that the parents could dish up things and say, "One for Teddy and one for you." That sort of thing gets there. I don't think we granted certain that. We may have. But often you do get that sort of a thing. I remember you want to hear any more of this?
Absolutely.
In the Certiorari department, one of the southeastern railroads, a conductor riding in the caboose of a freight train, along came a tornado and wiped out the caboose and the conductor. And he sued, or his widow sued, claiming that the railroad was negligent in not getting the train out of the way of the tornado. And believe it or not, she got to a jury on that issue. And as so often happened in those cases, she got a verdict. But the Court of Appeals overturned it, and this was a common sort of case, actually. They petitioned for review of the fact that the Court of Appeals had taken away their jury verdict, and Douglas and Black routinely voted to grant cert, and all the rest of them routinely voted to deny, so they almost never got. It's something I was thinking about a little while ago and forgot to mention. Talking about Brown v. Board of Education. I'm morally certain I'm right because I've thought about it years ago. The opportunity to review separate but equal had offered itself several times for years, and the court just never granted cert. I think that was in part due to the personality of Fred Vinson versus Earl Warren. But there may have been more to it, I'm not sure. But it always struck me as kind of interesting.
Do you remember, in the race area, do you remember a case called Shepard versus Florida? It was a black defendant, pretrial publicity, alleged rape of a white teenage girl, and there was discrimination in the grand jury, and on the basis of that, the court bounced it out. But then Jackson went out of his way to write a separate concurrence, which Felix joined, which is a real sort of anti-segregation manifesto, really, from Jackson. That was 1951.
But your question is, do I remember much about it?
Remember much about
the
that
direct
case?
answer to your question is no.
Okay.
But I might, if I went back and took another look at it.
Nice. There was I'm trying to think where I saw this. It was in a book by Professor Patterson dealing with Brown versus Board. But he had a mention of a quote by Justice Jackson where he said, by 1953, Justice Jackson stated that the Vinson Court no longer respects impersonal rules of law, but is guided in these matters by personal impressions which from time to time may be shared by a majority of the justices. Did you get any sense that of Jackson's feeling towards Vinson at the time, or just that was kind of the way the rule of law may not have been as...
And I guess what he was saying is that things weren't as consistent under Vinson as you'd like them to be.
I think so.
And I suspect that what you say could have been true, though he never criticized Vinson in conversations to me. Not that I remember.
What about Douglas?
He and Douglas didn't see eye to eye on very much. And I just as soon not get into too much of that, but Douglas was the one man. Jackson just didn't much care for him.
Did you have a sense of there having been a relationship, back in the New Deal days, that they
No.
once were friends or once
No,
thought better of each other than they did?
no.
Here we are in Chautauqua County, Chautauqua Institution, 50 years after the death of Justice Jackson. You were his clerk a little more than 50 years ago. What's his legacy?
Respect for law. He felt very strongly about that. And that's kind of a hard thing to define. But I hope it's self-explanatory when I say respect for the law, which is what he preached.
Your 2 years with him, what impact did that have on you and your further career?
Well, it was an enormously rewarding experience. And in a sense, it taught me in the practical, speaking back way, about the validity of being prepared and the amount of effort you could spend, and also the point of being independent. I mean, speaking your mind, which I was known for doing. And it really didn't make a whole lot of difference who was involved. Sometimes it almost got me into trouble, but not quite. I love to brief and argue appellate cases. I never really thought seriously of going on the bench myself because I'm not a political animal. And if I were to go on if lightning were to strike and I was to go on the bench, I would not take a trial court seat. And I tried some cases. I'm not qualified to be a trial law judge.
This has been terrific, George.
Oh, come on, you always say
I
that.
know that, but it is. Steve, you want to jump in?
No,
Yeah,
I thought it's been very fun. I'm not sure I have any serious questions.
Because I know that George, we want to make sure that he got up too late today for the normal breakfast, but I want to make sure he gets to lunch.
Okay, yeah.
Absolutely.
No, I did get some breakfast, but only by twisting that girl's arm to send her back.
They're pretty nice folks over. This is at the Athenaeum.
Right.
They're easy to twist. I'm sure she was happy.
Well, no, I don't think she was. I don't think she was happy at all.
Well,
But, I've traveled, during my work, I traveled a lot. And I've traveled a lot in the last 50 years. And that's, by all odds, the oldest hotel I ever stayed in.
yeah, it's a classic.
The only one that might come close is one in Austin, Texas. But this one is in a class by itself.
Okay.
Is this the first time you've been here? This is the
No,
first
I've
time
been,
you've Anthony?
first time I've ever stayed there.
Did you guys talk about the house?
Go ahead.
The actual sale of the house was Jackson to your
Blaha,
or to Blaha.
Julius Blaha.
Okay. Did your father rent the house? Or?
Yes.
Yes. What time period was that? That's. I mean, I know you're not living there, but that's when Jackson's not yet on the court.
Right.
Okay.
It was as I was getting out of Euclid Avenue School and starting into Lincoln Junior High School.
Oh, so you did live there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
You
Okay.
bet.
Okay, I thought you were away at prep school.
No, that didn't come till later.
Okay. So how many years did you live?
Not very long. At the time, it seemed like quite a while, but it wasn't more than outside, I don't think, 2 years.
Are there any, features or nooks or crannies or Jackson tidbits that you associate with the house?
Well, when he used to come to visit, you've seen his dog Jerry, which, Jerry is very important to me, as Jerry did not adjust well to life in Virginia. So RSJ asked if we would take Jerry over, and Jerry became my dog. And we were really buddies. And I remember one of the things about with Jackson coming back to visit, he would come in, and that dog would go crazy. And it would be a couple of years since he'd seen him, but Jerry would just go absolutely bonkers to see him again. And he loved to come in the winter and stand in front of a fireplace with his hands behind his back, warming them.
Mm-hmm.
Let him do that by the hour.
Mm-hmm. Was there a little bell in the dining room floor to?
I think so.
To call
The maid.
the maid.
Right, and it was always people were going like this, trying to find the dumb thing.
All right, so you'd sort of hit it with your toe. That was
Yeah.
it. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It was a nice house.
Right.
I have no idea who built it.
Jackson.
Did he?
Yeah. Yeah.
No kidding.
You bet.
There was a vacant lot. Just put together a bunch of vacant
Put
lots.
together a few
Well, a long strip of stuff that
down to
went
the creek.
all the way down past the creek up to, what's his name's property line. No, I know every square inch of that lot.
Okay.
Had a nice orchard in it
Okay.
and a green shed type garage in which Bill had a retired Ford Model T truck, which the horn still worked.
Okay.
And now, when you talk about him building the house, I don't know. Because we had a telephone between the house and the green shed that you cranked,
Uh-huh.
and it still worked.
Okay.
And I would have thought that they were long past that kind of phone by the time he. Well, you know better than I. If he built the house, he built the house.
1920.
Yeah, we did some title search work and the whole bit, and he parceled it, put it all together. I don't know who actually was a contractor, but clearly it was a vacant lot, and he built his house there. And then moved from, I believe, Spruce out there.
That's right. I don't have that stuff with me.
Well, I don't know where we lived before that. Remember one interesting thing about the garage. Daughter Mary one time drove the car right through the back wall of the garage. It's part of her learning experience with an automobile.
Thought that was the brake pedal.
Which pedal?
So the operating assumption seems to have been that he was coming back to Jamestown
Yes, at that time.
at that time.
Well, at least they didn't know.
Right.
If he had not gone on the court, I find it a little hard to believe that he would have come back to Jamestown.
Mm-hmm.
I think he would have wound up either in D.C. or in New York.
Mm-hmm.
But we never talked about his situation. When I was there, for most of the time I was there, the assumption was that I was going to come back to Jamestown and practice law.
Okay.
But that was that. Are you going to keep him down on the farm?
Uh-huh. Right.
After I'd seen life in Washington and that sort of thing, practice in Jamestown didn't have the appeal that it once did. Now the practice in law in Jamestown is fine, and so are all the lawyers. But I don't think it was anything that I wanted to be involved with.
When you were clerking, did Jackson ever talk about leaving the court, or was his
No.
assumption that he would serve until?
Until fate removed
Until
him,
fate
which in
removed
fact
him.
it did.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.